Picture this: the world's most desired woman, surrounded by luxury and adoration, yet so desperately lonely. She'd rather face eternity than another day of emptiness. That was Brigitte Bardot's reality. And today, we're uncovering the heartbreaking truth behind the glamorous facade. For nearly 2 decades, she embodied everything society was afraid of. That platinum blonde hair, those captivating lips, and an attitude that made censors tremble while audiences couldn't look away. But here's what they don't mention in those glossy film histories. Brigitte Bardot was shaped by an older gentleman when she was just a teenager, tried to end her own life so many times that friends kept her under constant watch, and abandoned her only child with such coldness that she referred to him as something she never wanted to bring into this world. The woman who became the symbol of the liberated 1960s woman was actually caught in a cycle of depression and self-destruction that began with a suffocating childhood and continued through 4 marriages, countless relationships, and a fame that felt more like imprisonment than blessing. What most people don't realize is that beneath the confident persona lay a woman so hungry for genuine love that she'd rather face oblivion than another day of emptiness. Today, we're exploring 8 secrets about Brigitte Bardot that reveal the tortured soul behind the bombshell image. And trust me, the real story is far more tragic than any role she ever performed. Secret 1: the childhood that crushed her spirit. Brigitte Bardot entered this world on September 28, 1934, into a wealthy, strictly Catholic family in Paris's 15th arrondissement. But behind the luxurious 7-bedroom apartment lived a childhood that was oppressive, controlling, and emotionally devastating. Her father, Louis Bardot, was a successful engineer working in the family chemical manufacturing business, Charles Bardot and Company, while her mother, Anne-Marie Moussel, was a perfectionist who raised her daughters with great discipline. Everything about her upbringing was rigid, from her posture to her manners to her very thoughts. What most people don't realize is that both Brigitte and her younger sister, Maïjanou, were raised in an atmosphere of constant criticism and extremely high standards. Anne-Marie Bardot was obsessed with appearances and social status, demanding that her daughters be perfect representatives of the family name at all times. But the most painful wound was how Brigitte felt increasingly pushed aside, as her parents clearly favored Maïjanou. Over time, I felt that I was moving away from my parents, that Maïjanou was their favorite, Bardot would later confess, revealing how this childhood rejection planted the seeds of her lifelong struggle with feeling unloved. Brigitte was naturally gifted in ballet at 13 years old, but was constantly criticized for not being thin enough, not being disciplined enough, not being perfect enough. The same parents who believed in modesty were pushing their teenage daughter into a world where her body was scrutinized and judged by strangers. It was through ballet that Brigitte first learned to dissociate, to separate her mind from her body, to perform while feeling nothing. This skill would serve her well as an actress, but it also laid the foundation for a lifetime of emotional numbness and self-destructive behavior. The final crushing blow came when her parents made it clear that they didn't see acting as a respectable career. They wanted their daughter to marry well. When Brigitte showed interest in pursuing entertainment, she was told she was being selfish, unrealistic, and bringing shame on the family name. This constant criticism and emotional withholding created in Brigitte a desperate hunger for validation and love that no amount of fame or adoration could ever satisfy. She would spend her entire life trying to fill the void left by parents who saw her as a reflection of themselves rather than a person worthy of unconditional love. Secret 2: the predatory relationship that launched her career. At just 15 years old, Brigitte Bardot met Roger Vadim, and this encounter would change her life forever, but not in the fairy tale way most people imagine. What happened was actually a textbook case of an older gentleman grooming a vulnerable teenager for his own purposes. Roger Vadim was born January 26, 1928, making him 7 years older than Bardot when he first spotted her, and he wasn't just attracted to her beauty, he was calculating about her potential. He recognized that she embodied a new type of appeal that could revolutionize cinema, and he set about molding her into his vision of the perfect woman. The age gap might not seem shocking by today's standards, but in 1949, the power dynamic was overwhelming. Vadim was a sophisticated gentleman connected to the film industry, while Brigitte was a sheltered teenager from a strict Catholic family. He represented everything her parents had warned her against, and everything she desperately wanted. What makes this relationship so troubling is how calculated Vadim's approach was. He didn't just fall in love with a teenager. He saw her as raw material to be shaped. He introduced her to literature, philosophy, and a bohemian lifestyle that was completely foreign to her conservative upbringing. But this wasn't de-education. It was indoctrination. Vadim convinced Brigitte that her parents' values were outdated and repressive, that true liberation meant rejecting everything she had been taught. While there was some truth to this, her upbringing had been stifling. Vadim's version of liberation was just another form of control. They married on December 20th, 1952, when Brigitte was 18 years old. The wedding was rushed because Vadim was eager to begin his project of transforming his young wife into a screen goddess. He immediately began planning the film that would make her famous, and God created woman. The 1956 film wasn't just Brigitte's breakthrough. It was Vadim's masterpiece of manipulation. He created a movie that was essentially a showcase for his wife's appeal, presenting her as a wild, uninhibited creature who lived purely by instinct. The character of Juliette was everything Brigitte's parents feared she would become, and everything Vadim wanted her to be. But here's the devastating truth. The confident, liberated woman on screen was actually a terrified young woman who had been completely cut off from her support system. Vadim had systematically isolated her from her family, convincing her that they were the enemy of her authentic self. The film made Brigitte internationally famous, but it also trapped her in an image that she could never escape. She became the embodiment of freedom, but she was actually the creation of someone who had shaped her identity from the time she was a child. The liberation that made her famous was actually just another form of imprisonment. When their marriage ended in 1957, Brigitte was left with fame, fortune, and a public image that bore little resemblance to who she really was underneath. She had been transformed from a sheltered teenager into a global icon, but she had lost herself in the process. Secret 3. The documented attempts that nearly ended everything. Brigitte Bardot made multiple attempts to end her own life throughout her lifetime, each attempt revealing the profound despair that lay beneath her glamorous image. While sources vary on exact dates and total numbers, verified reports confirm at least 4 serious attempts between 1960 and 1983. These weren't cries for help or publicity stunts. They were the desperate actions of a woman who felt trapped in a life that had become unbearable. The first documented attempt occurred around 1960, when Bardot was at the height of her fame. Academic sources confirm a serious crisis during this period, connected to her relationship difficulties and the pressures of stardom. The incident was largely hushed up by the studio, but those close to her knew it was a genuine attempt. What made this first attempt so shocking was the timing. From the outside, Bardot had everything: international fame, wealth, and the adoration of millions. But the reality was that she felt completely alone. The constant public scrutiny, the endless demands on her time and body, and the superficial nature of her relationships had left her feeling like a prisoner in her own life. Another documented attempt occurred in the context of her tumultuous personal relationships and custody battles, particularly following her bitter divorce from Jacques Charrier and the custody battle over their son Nicholas. The most serious documented attempt happened on September 28, 1983, on her 49th birthday, when Bardot took an overdose of medication with wine. She had to be rushed to the hospital where her life was saved. This attempt was particularly devastating as she had been retired from acting for a decade and had seemingly found peace in her animal rights work. But the demons of her past still haunted her. What connected all these attempts was a common thread. Bardot felt fundamentally unlovable. Despite being desired by millions, she couldn't believe that anyone could love her for who she really was rather than what she represented. Each relationship that ended, each failure to connect authentically with another person, reinforced her belief that she was fundamentally flawed. The most heartbreaking aspect of these attempts was how alone she felt, even when surrounded by people. Bardot was constantly surrounded by hangers-on, admirers, and business associates, but she had very few genuine friendships. The price of fame was isolation, and that isolation became unbearable. Between attempts, Bardot would experience periods of manic energy, where she would throw herself into work, relationships, or causes with desperate intensity. But these periods were always followed by crashes into depression, where the fundamental emptiness of her existence would become overwhelming. The fact that she survived all attempts wasn't due to half-heartedness. It was due to the intervention of friends, medical professionals, and sometimes pure luck. Each time she was saved, she would emerge more fragile, more convinced that she was broken beyond repair. Secret 4. The son she rejected. Perhaps the most heartbreaking secret of Brigitte Bardot's life is her relationship with her only child, Nicolas Jacques Charrier, born on January 11, 1960. The story of how she treated her son reveals a level of emotional cruelty that shocked even her critics and destroyed any chance of a normal mother-child relationship. When Bardot discovered she was expecting by actor Jacques Charrier, her reaction was not joy, but horror. She had always been ambivalent about motherhood, viewing it as a threat to her career and freedom. The pregnancy was particularly traumatic because she desperately wanted to terminate her son, but couldn't find anyone willing to perform the procedure. Even backroom medical practitioners were afraid to take a chance with someone as famous as she had become. In her desperation, she repeatedly harmed herself and sought morphine from doctors, anything to end what she saw as an unwanted invasion of her body. In her 1996 autobiography, Initials BB, Bardot wrote devastatingly about her pregnancy and son, describing her unborn child as an unwanted burden that she tried to remove by harming herself. From the moment he was born, Bardot made it clear that she resented her son's existence. She spoke publicly about never wanting him, and that motherhood was a burden she was forced to bear. These weren't private thoughts kept to herself. She said these things publicly, ensuring that her son would grow up knowing exactly how his mother felt about him. The cruelty didn't stop there. When Nicolas was young, Bardot essentially abandoned him, leaving him in the care of his father, while she pursued her career and love affairs. She made no effort to maintain a relationship with him, treating him as an inconvenience rather than a human being who needed his mother's love. During the custody battle with Jacques Charrier, legal proceedings confirmed Bardot's rejection of motherhood. Both Jacques Charrier and Nicolas successfully sued Bardot for the damaging content in her autobiography, with the court ordering her to pay damages for the pain her words had caused. Nicolas grew up knowing that his mother, who was beloved by millions around the world, had no love for him. He struggled with this rejection throughout his life, and despite following in his mother's footsteps with animal rights activism, he never received the acknowledgement or affection he deserved. The tragedy of this relationship is that Bardot's rejection of her son was rooted in her own childhood trauma. Having been raised by emotionally distant parents, she had no template for healthy parental love. Her inability to bond with Nicolas was partly due to her own psychological wounds, but this explanation doesn't excuse the cruelty of her public statements. As of recent reports, Bardot had not seen her son in over a decade and had no contact with her granddaughters. She became a great-grandmother in February 2014, when her granddaughter Anna gave birth to a girl, but maintained her emotional distance from her family. Secret 5. The numerous relationships and the search for authentic connection. According to her biographers, Brigitte Bardot had intimate relationships with approximately 100 people during her lifetime, including both men and women. This wasn't just liberation. It was a desperate search for the authentic love and connection that had been missing from her life since childhood. The sheer number of relationships reveals the depth of Bardot's emotional hunger. She wasn't just collecting conquests. She was repeatedly hoping that the next person would be the one who could finally fill the void left by her emotionally distant parents and the exploitation of her early relationships. Her affairs included some of the most famous names of her era. Reports suggest relationships with Warren Beatty, Sean Connery, and many others. But what's most telling is that despite the fame, and attractiveness of her partners, none of these relationships provided the emotional fulfillment she was seeking. One of the most poignant aspects of her romantic life was her unexpected deep friendship with Alain Delon, who became one of the few people who truly understood her pain. Despite both being icons of their generation, Delon revealed that nothing ever happened between them romantically. Instead, they shared the best friendship for 65 years. This platonic bond with another icon who understood the burden of fame became one of the most stable relationships in her life, proving that what she truly craved was genuine connection rather than physical passion. What made these relationships particularly tragic was the pattern they followed. Bardot would become intensely infatuated with someone, convinced that they were her salvation. She would throw herself into the relationship with great intensity, only to become disillusioned when the person couldn't live up to her expectations. The inclusion of women in her list of lovers was particularly scandalous for the time, but it reveals something important about Bardot's psychology. She wasn't just seeking variety, she was seeking someone, anyone, who could provide the unconditional love she had never received. One of her most significant relationships was with singer Serge Gainsbourg, who wrote some of her most famous songs. Their connection was intense and creative, but it was also marked by the same pattern of idealization, followed by disappointment, that characterized all her relationships. The most heartbreaking aspect of these numerous relationships was that they reinforced Bardot's belief that she was unlovable. Each time a relationship ended, she interpreted it as proof that she wasn't worthy of lasting love. Rather than recognizing that she was setting impossible standards and seeking things that no human relationship could provide, she blamed herself for being fundamentally flawed. The relationships also became increasingly superficial as Bardot aged. What had started as genuine attempts to connect became more about validation and distraction from her inner emptiness. She was using romance and intimacy as a way to numb the pain of her isolation. The tragic irony is that Bardot's search for love was self-defeating. Her intense longing for love scared off potential partners, while her fame made it impossible to know if people were interested in her or in the idea of being with Brigitte Bardot. She became trapped in a cycle where her need for love made love impossible to find. By the time she retired from acting, Bardot had essentially given up on human relationships entirely. She retreated to her home in Saint-Tropez with her animals, convinced that only non-human creatures could provide the uncomplicated affection she craved. Secret 6. The mental breakdown that changed everything. In 1973, at the age of 39, Brigitte Bardot suffered a complete mental breakdown that forced her to confront the reality of her psychological state and ultimately led to her retirement from acting. This breakdown wasn't just a bad day or a temporary setback. It was a total collapse that revealed the extent of her internal suffering. The breakdown occurred during what would become her final phase of acting work. Witnesses described her as becoming increasingly agitated and expressing paranoid thoughts about people trying to harm her. The incident marked a turning point where the carefully maintained image of the confident icon completely cracked. What made this breakdown particularly devastating was that it happened in a professional context, destroying the carefully maintained facade. For the first time, people saw Bardot as she really was, a deeply troubled woman who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will. The immediate trigger for the breakdown was the realization that she had been living a lie for decades. The confident, liberated woman she played on screen was so far from who she really was that maintaining the facade had become psychologically impossible. She described feeling like she was wearing a mask that had become permanently attached to her face. The breakdown was also connected to her growing awareness of how the entertainment industry had exploited her. She began to understand that she had been packaged and sold as a commodity, that her appeal had been commercialized for other people's profit, and that she had been complicit in her own exploitation. The paranoid thoughts that accompanied the breakdown weren't entirely unfounded. Bardot had been stalked, harassed, and threatened by fans and critics for years. The constant invasion of her privacy had created a legitimate fear for her safety, but it had also made her unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. During her recovery, Bardot underwent intensive therapy, where she finally began to to confront the trauma of her childhood and the psychological damage caused by her early relationship with Roger Vadim. For the first time, she began to understand that her desperate need for validation and her inability to form healthy relationships were symptoms of deeper psychological wounds. The breakdown also forced her to confront her relationship with her son Nicholas. In therapy, she began to understand that her rejection of him was connected to her own feelings of being unloved and unwanted. However, this understanding came too late to repair the damage she had done to their relationship. The most significant outcome of the breakdown was Bardot's decision to retire from acting in 1973. She realized that continuing to perform would mean continuing to live a lie, and she no longer had the psychological strength to maintain the facade. Retirement wasn't just a career decision. It was a survival strategy. However, the breakdown also marked the beginning of Bardot's transformation into an animal rights activist. Her identification with animals as innocent victims resonated with her own sense of having been victimized by the entertainment industry. Caring for animals became a way of caring for the wounded child within herself. Secret 7. The controversial statements that surprised her fans. What many people don't know is that Brigitte Bardot's later years have been marked by a series of views and political statements that have completely overshadowed her contributions to cinema and animal rights. Since the 1990s, she has been convicted and fined 5 times by French courts for reprimanding specific ethnic groups, showing a side of her personality that surprised her longtime supporters. This began in the 1990s when Bardot started making statements about Islam and immigration in France. What started as concern of certain practices evolved into broad generalizations about entire ethnic and religious groups. Bardot has been convicted 5 times for sharing her convictions that date back to 1997. The fines have totaled tens of thousands of euros, and each incident has been more controversial than the last. Her comments have included calling certain populations degenerate and making general statements about the incompatibility of different cultures. Bardot is known to use her animal rights activism as a platform to share her political views. She has frequently connected her opposition to certain animal practices with criticism of the ethnic and religious groups that practice them. Her most recent convictions occurred in 2008, when she was fined 15,000 euros for her 5th conviction. The charge arose from a letter she wrote to the then Interior Minister, in which she made statements about Muslims. Her political views hindered her relationships with some former colleagues and friends who had more liberal views. She has become increasingly isolated, surrounded by those who share her same, more conservative views. Today, we've seen ongoing changes in Europe regarding immigration. What are your thoughts? Do you share her concerns about these issues, or are you comfortable with Europe's current direction? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Secret 8. The lonely hermit behind the animal sanctuary. Today, at 90 years old, Brigitte Bardot lives as a virtual hermit in her Saint-Tropez estate, surrounded by rescued animals, but cut off from almost all human contact. Bardot's current life is a stark contrast to the glamorous image most people still associate with her. She rarely leaves her property, avoids all public appearances, and has severed ties with most of her former friends and colleagues. Her world has shrunk to her animals and the small staff who help care for them. Bardot has surrounded herself with high walls, security cameras, and protective measures, creating a barrier between herself and the outside world. Yet beneath this isolation lies a woman who has spent decades quietly saving lives. Since founding her Animal Rights Foundation in 1986, Bardot has personally rescued thousands of animals, often intervening directly in crisis situations. She has donated over $140,000 to save Bucharest's stray pets, funded mass sterilization programs across Europe, and transformed her own estate into a sanctuary for hundreds of abandoned animals. When she auctioned off her jewelry and personal belongings to raise 3 million francs for her foundation, she was essentially giving away pieces of her glamorous past to save creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Bardot has repeatedly stated that she prefers animals to humans because they offer unconditional love. Her relationship with her current husband, Bernard Dormale, whom she married on August 16, 1992, manages her affairs and protects her from the outside world. It is rumored that their relationship lacks the emotional intimacy that Bardot has always claimed to seek. The most heartbreaking aspect of her current situation is her estrangement from her son Nicholas. Despite his attempts to reconcile with her over the years, she has maintained her emotional distance. In 2023, at age 89, Bardot suffered a health scare that highlighted just how isolated she had become. During a heat wave in Saint-Tropez, she experienced serious breathing difficulties and had to be treated by emergency services. The incident served as a stark reminder of her vulnerability and the fact that, despite being surrounded by rescued animals, she faces old age with very few human connections to support her. Her daily routine consists of caring for her animals and managing her foundation. In recent interviews, Bardot has expressed her loneliness, stating, "I have no one left. Everyone is gone," revealing her grief over the loss of many of her friends. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of her current existence is how it mirrors her childhood. Just as she was trapped in her parents' suffocating home, she has now trapped herself. The walls that were once imposed by others are now maintained by her own choice. So there you have it, 8 secrets that reveal Brigitte Bardot as far more than just a beautiful face who changed cinema forever. What strikes me most about her story is how it perfectly illustrates the devastating cost of fame without emotional foundation, and how unresolved trauma can affect even the most successful life. Here was someone who had everything the world could offer: beauty, talent, wealth, adoration from millions, yet she remained fundamentally unable to accept love or give it authentically. Her desperate search for connection led her through numerous lovers, 4 marriages, and countless affairs, but none of them could fill the void left by emotionally distant parents and exploitative early relationships. The most tragic aspect of Bardot's story is how her pain affected innocent people, particularly her son Nicholas. Her inability to love herself made it impossible for her to love him, perpetuating a cycle of emotional damage that could have been broken with proper support and therapy. When we look at Bardot's transformation from icon to animal rights activist, we see both redemption and tragedy. Her work with animals represents genuine compassion and has saved countless lives, but it also represents a retreat from the human world she found too painful to navigate. At 90, Brigitte Bardot remains alive, surrounded by animals who can't judge her or make emotional demands she can't fulfill. Her estate in Saint-Tropez is a place where she can finally feel safe. Looking back at Bardot's life, I'm struck by how her story serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of emotional health and authentic relationships. All the fame and beauty in the world couldn't compensate for the love she never received as a child and the psychological wounds she never properly addressed. Brigitte Bardot wasn't just an actress. She was a wounded child who never found the healing she needed. Someone who transformed her pain into performances that touched millions, but who never learned to transform her pain into peace. Her story reminds us that behind every icon lies a human being, struggling with the same fundamental needs for love, acceptance, and connection that drive us all. Sometimes the most beautiful people are the most broken, and sometimes the most confident facades hide the deepest despair. What do you think? Did Brigitte Bardot's story surprise you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed discovering the truth behind this golden age icon, you'll definitely want to subscribe for more untold stories about the legends you thought you knew. Trust me, we've got plenty more secrets to uncover together.